Hi, I'm Martin Pritikin, the Dean of Concord Law School at Purdue University Global, the nation's first fully online law school. Welcome to this latest installment in our distinguished speaker webinar series titled Expeditionary Law, Foreign Dealmaking and the Problem of Corruption. I'm delighted that our featured guest today is an alumnus of Concord Law School. Conan Higgins has his own consulting firm, TSI Legal Enterprises PC, and also serves as general counsel for Veterans Carriers, Inc., a veteran-owned transportation company. In the last year, Conan was named General Counsel of the Year not once, but twice by both BEMG Media in its Global 100 Awards and by Lawyer Monthly magazine. Now, to be clear, he wasn't just named to a list of top general counsel, he was named as the General Counsel of the Year. In addition to his JD from Concord, Conan earned an LLM in International Business Law from the University of Liverpool and is pursuing a doctorate in international law and treaty law at Euclid University. He's also studied mediation and negotiation mastery from Harvard Law School and Harvard Business School. He has served as the vice chair for the American Bar Association's section of International Law Middle East Committee and the International Anti-Money Laundering Committee. He's a fellow of the Institute of Leadership and Management and an associate member of the Chartered Institute of Legal Executives in the United Kingdom. He's published a dissertation on improving corporate governance education in emerging markets in sub-Saharan Africa and a review on anti-money laundering practices in Afghanistan for the American Bar Association. Conan, thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate you taking your time.
Thank you, Marty. I appreciate it. And as I said, I'm honored and humbled to be part of this.
Well, thank you. One note before we get going for our audience, if you're tuning in on Facebook Live, as we go, feel free to post questions in the chat box, and time permitting, we'll try and incorporate some of those into our conversation. So Conan, I described your education and some of your experience in law, but that's only one piece of the puzzle. You have a background in the military and in business as well, which I think is highly relevant to what you're going to be talking about today. Tell us a little bit about that background.
Sure. Well, I've served for 25 years in the Air Force Special Operations between active duty and the Air National Guard. And while I was in the Air National Guard, I was also a state trooper in Washington. I was an undercover detective. I was a SWAT entry team leader. And there were many other things that I had to do in order to transition from the military into the business sector. I got a job as a salesman, essentially, for a consulting business selling management services, and that was a commission-only job. So if I didn't sell, I didn't eat. Well, obviously, I missed too many meals, right? But within 3 months of that, I was already a corporate trainer. I was an assistant regional manager covering a region that was Western Canada, like the entire western half of Canada, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, California down to San Luis Obispo, and half of Nevada. I think the biggest thing that I can take out of all of this is that I was going to law school at the same time. So when I finished working for that consulting business, I took some contracting jobs, working some classified programs for the government in Afghanistan and the Philippines. And so there's a picture somewhere of me studying federal tax law in the Korengal, which is a particularly notorious area of Konar province. That's where the movie Lone Survivor took place. Mm-hmm. If anybody's heard the story of Restrepo, the outpost, that was in that area. And so I took some ribbing and teasing over that as I studied under a poncho with a red lens flashlight. When I was in the Philippines, there was a notorious Typhoon Ondoy, which was huge, caused a tsunami in Samoa. That was in 2009. And I had to pirate Wi-Fi. I can say that. I think the statute of limitations is passed. So, but that was to complete assignments and stay on track to graduation. Just a plug for Concord that I could not have done it without it being fully online. I know my story is probably different than most, but the only way that I could do it was through the asynchronous delivery that Concord offers.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And I should make clear that we did not ask you to come on to plug Concord, but if you have good things to say, I certainly appreciate it. And I should also mention, I don't know if folks saw my post on social media, but I wanted to title this "The Most Interesting Man in the World." Already we've just gotten a taste of some of the places you've been, the things you've done, and it's really fascinating. Tell us a little more. Besides Afghanistan, the Philippines, and Canada, what other countries have you served in or done business in?
Okay, sure. In the military, I'll start there. I spent time in Panama, Korea, Japan, Germany, Italy, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, obviously Afghanistan, but Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, as well as Qatar and Bahrain in a professional capacity. And I'd like to say that in that professional capacity, I wasn't necessarily acting as a lawyer every time, but also as a legal project manager and sometimes as a legal business consultant. But I've done work in Costa Rica, Colombia, Ireland, England, Ukraine, Serbia, Germany, Romania, Afghanistan again, the UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Bahrain, and then in Africa, Kenya, Libya, Mali, Burkina Faso, which is pretty scary, Ethiopia, beautiful, Botswana, Liberia, and South Sudan, Tanzania and Ghana also. And so those projects were pretty diverse. Some of them were simply trying to establish medical clinics in Libya. That was back in 2012. In South Sudan, it was building housing and hotels for non-government organizations like Doctors Without Borders, and clean water projects in Ethiopia, and various ITAR-related projects in a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, or sub-Saharan African countries, and Colombia. But the one that's kind of near and dear to my heart is helping to establish and revitalize coffee farms in Costa Rica. That was pretty cool. And then I guess from a professional standpoint, a big feather in the cap is I helped to spearhead the first public-private partnership in Qatar, building humane and compliant worker accommodations for migrant workers there.
Wow, that's great. And you mentioned ITAR related. Can you just say, for those of us who aren't?
Yeah, I apologize. That's International Trafficking in Arms Regulations. So if anyone's seen the movie War Dogs, mm-hmm. That's a movie about some guys that get a contract to supply weapons and bullets, and they don't go about it the right way. They end up going to jail. So nobody's going to make a movie about me filling out permits and licenses and keeping the principals out of jail, but that's what I do. So, and it's not necessarily glamorous. There are things that are covered by the United States munitions list that aren't bombs, bullets, or weapons. They're technology or their services. Things like that. Anything that's on that list needs to have an export license or needs to be imported here from another country under license. And so that's what I've done.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, that is a breathtaking scope of the places you've been and the things you've done. And I think that's a good transition into the topic at hand. So, we're going to be talking about corruption, but I want to start by talking about the rule of law. They're obviously highly related concepts, although they're opposites in a sense. We've all probably heard of the rule of law, whether you've gone to law school or not. It's sort of a term that gets thrown around. Can you summarize, what do we mean when we say rule of law? What does that actually refer to?
Sure. Well, to boil it down, the rule of law essentially is talking about the equality of all individuals in society on the basis of the principle that every person is equal before the law. Right. So in societies where the rule of law is exercised, people have the opportunity to seek equal protection whenever a rights violation occurs, whether that's civil rights or business rights or whatever rights might be in question. But the lack of the rule of law, that's the main obstacle for people in their struggle for equity, equality, and against poverty. And in those circumstances, corruption is a daily occurrence. It's an everyday fact. And that does hinder socioeconomic development. In a lot of these countries where the rule of law is not prevalent, it's not adhered to, or just is missing, women, more than any others, they suffer high unemployment rates. And so that presents a problem to them. Often they're forced into prostitution or some other form of sex trafficking. So coupled with that, the authorities there for the most part, act with almost absolute impunity. And those are political and economic violations. The general populace is in abject poverty for the most part. Corruption is rampant, as I said, and the income by those government officials is pretty low, except for the very, very high-ranking individuals. So authorities at all levels of government there take bribes from businesses and other people trying to do business.
Now, you mentioned how you've worked or, been involved in activities in, by my count, at least 30 countries. So I don't expect you to go through every one, but
Thank
I'm
you.
curious if you can give some examples at least. How strong or weak has the rule of law been in your experience in the countries in which you've dealt?
Well, I don't think it's going to come as a surprise that the rule of law is well established in the West, right? And not so much in other places. Some places it's simply non-existent, especially in emerging economies. Now, that's not to say that corruption doesn't take place in the West, but places that have a firm adherence and a firm foundation of the rule of law don't allow for necessarily systemic corruption. That can be debated in another discussion, but my experience is that the lack of adherence allows for that systemic corruption versus the unscrupulous individual or group or entity that takes advantage of the gray areas of the law and in places where the rule of law is firmly established. If you know what the law says, you know what it doesn't say. And so people do like to play in the shadows there. But tradition and custom play a larger role in countries where the rule of law is not established or adhered to. And as I said, those economies usually are structured to benefit a few, right? We can use the term oligarch, we can patriarchs, we can use high-ranking government officials. In a lot of countries, they're all from the same family or tribe. So it doesn't allow for an equitable distribution of opportunity or wealth.
Are there any countries that I guess sort of buck the trend in the sense that, are there Western countries where the rule of law is not as strong as one might hope, or are there countries in more economically depressed regions like Sub-Saharan Africa or the Middle East? And I realize I'm painting with a broad swath, right? Every country is different, but I guess that's the point of my question is, are there countries that don't sort of fit, a stereotype of just being part of a broader region where the rule of law is sort of an outlier for good or for bad?
Sure. Well, when I say the West, I think that can be pretty nebulous in and of itself, right? Of course, Ukraine is in the news today for the conflict that's going on there, but the corruption that was happening in Ukraine prior to the invasion was notorious and rampant. And in 2016, I actually helped a group to submit a proposal to the US AID to study and combat corruption in Ukraine. So maybe that's one where you'd think, well, they're a Western country, at least Westernized, but Eastern Europe, I think it's as a result of the fall of the Soviet Union and the power vacuum, and you have oligarchs that came in and grabbed businesses and opportunities. And so while on paper, the rule of law is there, you will find corruption fairly rampant. I mentioned I worked in Romania. Romania is very much a great, beautiful, wonderful country, but there are people who take advantage of those gray areas that I mentioned.
Right.
Now, with regards to countries where you might not think that it would be well established, let's look at Africa. Botswana. Botswana is a very, very good place to do business as a foreign direct investor, because the economy is going well. The government understands that direct foreign investment helps growth, helps stabilize their payrolls and cash flows, if you will. So that's a place where again, I'm just trying to give two quick examples where you might think one thing and then find the other to be more accurate.
And I assume it's similar in other regions. I mean, the Middle East, I assume there's a wide variety in how strong the rule of law in various places. Is that right?
Absolutely. So as I mentioned, I worked all around the Gulf. There are laws there, but and I'll speak of Qatar for a minute. A lot of the medium or mid-level functionaries are from a different country. And so they bring with them their traditions, they bring with them their customs, and they bring their understanding of what's right and what's wrong. And so if it's normal in their country that you pay a fee, put that in air quotes if you want, right? A fee to get jobs done, then they're going to try to pass that on to anybody in the business realm in Qatar. Now, it doesn't mean that it's right, doesn't mean that it's not frowned upon, but it does happen.
Yeah, it's understandable, I guess. Now, the United States has a number of laws that attempt to prevent or limit corruption, not just domestically, but particularly in the international arena. We're going to talk about those. The main or most prominent one is probably the Fcpa. What is that law and why was it passed? And I guess when was it passed and why?
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and it was enacted in 1977. And it generally prohibits the payment of bribes to foreign officials to assist in obtaining or retaining business.
And why? I mean, maybe this seems crass, but I mean, to put it bluntly, why does America care if there's corruption in foreign countries?
Well, it's one of those. I mean, again, this is a great question because we could devote an entire discussion to it. If we know what the rules are, we can play the game better. Would you agree? If we don't know what the rules are, and I don't know how you're going to play the game, that makes it a little unfair because I may show up to let's say a soccer game and you've got a hockey stick, and every time I touch the ball, you smack me with it. Well, that's not a fair way to play the game of soccer, is it? No. And so when we're doing business overseas, we need to understand that everybody's on the same page, everybody's working from the same playbook, and everybody understands that certain things will not be tolerated, but there are certain things, payments, et cetera, that have to be made. What are those and why are they being made? And what's the accountability for making those payments? Those are the rules behind the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Those are the provisions that people have to adhere to in order to keep that field a level field and to work against corruption so that everybody has, and it goes back to what I said earlier, the equity of opportunity.
Right. So let's talk in a little more detail about the Fcpa. So who does it apply to? Who does it cover? Is it governments, businesses, individuals? Who's subject to that act?
So, well, first of all, it can apply anywhere in the world for American businesses, but it extends to publicly traded companies and their officers, directors, employees, stockholders, et cetera, as well as agents, third-party agents, consultants, distributors, joint venture partners, et cetera. Private companies can also run afoul of the Fcpa, and that's a little different. That's more, I guess, less likely to happen, but it does happen. So essentially, any American business or any business, let's say a bank that has depositor accounts in the U.S. is held to the standards of the Fcpa.
And so what sort of conduct does it proscribe? I mean, certainly I would imagine literally paying a bribe to a government official in another country to get a contract to develop infrastructure or, a skyscraper or something. I would imagine that's covered. Is that all that's covered, or is there more than that?
No, and I actually used to talk about in 2012 there were two notable cases of Fcpa violations, both concerning big pharma. One was Pfizer, one was Eli Lilly. And they were both hit pretty hard, and it was for bribes. But and we might talk about this a little later. But there are predicate offenses for which the Fcpa acts as a catalyst to further, deeper, bigger, broader investigations, like the RICO Act, which we can talk about later if you want. I would say that, as I said, Pfizer and Eli Lilly, big companies, have subsidiaries, and let's look at that from what I said before about the principals versus the agents. Those subsidiaries act as an agent. They are looking for increased market penetration. They are looking for formula approvals. They are looking for increased sales. So all of those things would be reason to want to do business and improve your stock, but you have to do it legally. And in 2012, they didn't. So they both were hit, and I can go into that in more detail if you want. But as I said,
so I mean, were they just paying straight up bribes, or was it sort of more of a gray area?
No, they were paying bribes, but they were trying to confuse the issue through shoddy accounting. That's one of the things that the Fcpa provides for is if there are accounting, I guess, discrepancies or questions, the Department of Justice and the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, are going to dig deeper, and one has to account, for the origin of the monies and the ultimate destination of the monies. And when that's not done above board and clearly and transparently, that's a problem.
So you said it's a problem. So what happens, right? I mean, a law is only as effective as its enforcement mechanism. So if a company or an agent, they violate the FCPA, what are the potential consequences?
Well, it can be significant. And I can tell you that the letter of the law says that individuals will face up to 5 years for each violation of the anti-bribery provisions, or up to 20 years for certain willful violations. Let me be clear that you can be willfully ignorant and violate the FCPA. For instance, that's one of the things that Pfizer tried to pass off. They tried to say this was a subsidiary, we didn't know what they were doing. Well, that doesn't pass the straight face test, because as the parent organization, they should have known. So maximum fines, $25 million, et cetera, et cetera. That's all well and good. That's what it says on paper. But let me tell you about Pfizer. Pfizer was fined, or they paid $15 million to settle their FCPA investigation. But one of the provisions that the FCPA allows for is the disgorgement of profits made, as well as prejudgment interest. And so add to that 15 million, Pfizer also paid, I think, $47 million in disgorged profits and pre-penalty or prejudgment interest, excuse me. Eli Lilly was a little better. I think total between penalties and prejudgment interest and disgorgement, it was around 29 million total. But that's in 2012 dollars. So factor that for what that is today.
Right. Now, of course, those are big multi-billion-dollar companies. So
Absolutely.
You might say, hey, right, payment in the order of magnitude of tens of millions of dollars. Some might say that's a drop in the bucket for them, right? But I guess the thinking is, you're not trying to disgorge all profits the company's made from any of their activities, right? You want to disgorge profits from the illegal activity that violates the FCPA. So if
Absolutely.
you're going to basically be deprived of whatever profits you get from the illegal activity, plus up to 25 million on top of that, plus prejudgment interest, it really starts to put some teeth into the law and say, hey, not only are you not going to benefit from violating this law if you're found out, but you're going to end up losing money on it at the end of the day, so don't even try, right?
Well, absolutely. And I can tell you that while both Pfizer and Eli Lilly tried to be a little cute with the books to hide those payments, they were absolutely down to the penny to show which profits had come from those activities and which had not. So because they, like you said, they did not want to give up more than they had to.
And I'm curious, what tools does the government have to monitor or enforce this, right? You can only impose a penalty or disgorge profits if you find out there was a violation. Is the government actively searching out these types of things? Do they stumble across violations? How do they learn about them?
Well, to their credit, both Pfizer and Eli Lilly voluntarily reported. That may be because they were under suspicion of investigation. I can't speak to why they decided to come forward, but they did. And so that a lot of times people will realize they have stepped on the wrong side of the line and they will voluntarily disclose that. That doesn't mean you're off the hook. It's not like there's probably a ton of examples you could come up with, but it doesn't excuse the act. What it does is it allows for cooperation in resolution versus prosecution, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so basically it's, look, if you come to us and admit that you've, violated this law or may have violated this law, that's something we're going to factor in negotiating a resolution with you rather than just throwing the book at you.
Absolutely. And there, I can say that the Department of Justice, of course, does have an entire division dedicated to investigating this. For instance, Deutsche Bank, which, so I mentioned I used to talk about Pfizer and Eli Lilly. That was when I was discussing this because they're pretty well-known companies, but Deutsche Bank was the first FCPA violation to be resolved in 2021. And they did not self-report. They were found to be in violation of numerous different accounting provision violations, as well as payment. And I can get into a little bit about those red flags if you'd like in a little bit, but there are red flags, right? If you don't know what I'm sorry?
Yeah, what are some examples of those red flags?
Sure. So, I mean, you can be in danger of violating the law for doing business transactions in a place known for corruption, right? Right off the bat, it's a little bit suspect. Now, is that fair? No, but people before you ruined it. That's why they have a warning on McDonald's coffee cup saying caution hot, right?
Right.
So also, if the parties involved have a history of previous bribery allegations, or they have poor business reputations, I mean, these are red flags, right? You should know who you're going into business with. And if you don't, that can be looked at as willful negligence or willful ignorance because a simple lack of due diligence by the involved parties.
Right. Now, a couple of questions. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, this is a key one too. If a business is trying to transact in a foreign economy and they don't have if they don't have a compliance program at all, or it's very poor, kind of rudely constructed, that can also be a red flag because they're going into business without understanding the pitfalls.
Right. So basically, if you go in without sort of an infrastructure to try and prevent it from happening, then if something does happen, you're held more responsible because you didn't even try and prevent it, right?
Right. And so some people will not knowing how to do business in especially emerging economies, they'll hire a third party, right? An agent, so to speak. Right. But there are red flags associated with those business dealings too, right? And I should say, just as a refresher, if I didn't cover this before, I apologize, but the Fcpa really is if you boil it down, it's to prevent undue coercion or influence on a foreign government official. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that you're a foreign official in a place I want to do business, and I say, hey, I'll pay you X if you get me this business license. Well, that may or may not be legal. Okay, here in the States, if you want to incorporate a business, you can go to the Secretary of State's website for whatever state you're in. There's a form, you fill it out, and you pay the fee. Okay, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a little envelope under the table, so to speak, to use a little Hollywoodism. And that's not okay. Using a third party doesn't make it any better, especially if that third party is involved at the request of that foreign official, or is a relative, or let's say a close ally politically of that official. If the compensation is excessive for the use of that agent, or there could be opportunities for discounts. I want to sell you something, so I'm going to give you a deep discount if you buy it. Well, that's also improper. That's a red flag.
Right.
If we're using agents and we're not really describing or their services, even in an agreement, if it's vague, that can be a red flag. If they're not normally engaged in that business, that's a red flag. I mean, why are they doing it? Why are they here? Why would you hire them if they're not normally engaged in that? And then a big one that happened, and this was part of why Eli Lilly got in trouble, was using a shell company for an offshore jurisdiction or paying to offshore bank accounts. That should be a red flag to just about anybody. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't use offshore banking, but by itself, that's not necessarily bad. It's the totality of the circumstance. Right.
I want to ask a couple of follow-up questions. They are actually questions from the audience, which are questions I was thinking myself. So one is, you mentioned there's a possibility of jail time for individuals. Does that ever happen to your knowledge? Are there people who've gone to jail for violating the Fcpa?
I can't think of one right off the top of my head, but I would say without doubt, yes. And the reason for that is because if we look at the provisions of the Fcpa, it does not allow for the issuer to cover the costs and fines of people committing the bad act. So there's no indemnity allowed, right? The company can't indemnify the bad actors.
Right.
And so that means that they have a judgment against them specifically and personally. If that's criminal, then yes, that's jail time. If it's civil, that's monetary or some other form of restitution.
Right. The other question is, someone asked about, is there a whistleblower component to the FCPA? I know there are in other, like, Medicare fraud, things like that. And if enforcement is an issue, right, how can the Department of Justice or the SEC keep tabs on thousands of different companies, right? If there are those within the company who are incentivized to blow the whistle, that obviously helps. Is there anything like that in the FCPA?
Well, there are Whistleblower Act provisions within the FCPA. I don't know, incentivized is maybe the right word, but it's the FCPA really deals with a general moral viewpoint, right? Is it right? Is it wrong? Well, not your personal moral compass, but the compass of the FCPA. It says this is right, this is wrong. Which side of the line are you on? If I'm an employee working for a company that I know is on the wrong side of the line, and it doesn't sit well with me, I need to have an avenue where I can bring that to the DOJ or the SEC's attention. And the way they do that is through an anonymous whistleblower act. So.
Got it. Now let's talk about some other laws. You mentioned RICO before. What is RICO and how does that fit into anti-corruption?
Sure. Well, RICO is the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Corrupt Organizations Act. A little more water here. But that was passed in 1970. And the reason for that, if you go to your history books and you know that Bobby Kennedy was trying to take down organized crime and did a fairly good job of it before he was killed, but organized crime is still there. And we're not talking about the mafia, right, from the movies. Organized crime is defined as criminal activities that are planned and controlled by powerful groups and carried out on a large scale. So it doesn't have to be necessarily drugs or murder for hire or some sensational thing you could try to write a movie about. It can be simply like Deutsche Bank. They were making unlawful payments, and it was on a large scale. Now, what the RICO Act does allow for, right, and the whole purpose of it was to strengthen the legal tools for evidence gathering. So looking at one crime and prosecuting for that didn't used to necessarily convey a parallel prosecution for a seemingly unrelated crime, and RICO allows for that. But when we look at the totality of the circumstances, an organized crime unit often has their hands in multiple different criminal activities. Okay, we know with the Mexican cartels, it's drugs, it's weapons, it's human trafficking across the border. Those are all, possibly seemingly separate crimes, but they're all part and parcel of the same business venture, if you will. Right.
And I actually have a little experience with RICO myself, not violating it, but in my legal work, I actually was on a case where we sued Lehman Brothers in bankruptcy court after its collapse. And there were RICO allegations included. We actually got the law professor, I think he was at Notre Dame, who helped write the RICO Act to submit an expert report about the purposes of RICO and how it, has kind of morphed into a general business crime statute where, criminal enterprise is defined very broadly and, the criminal conduct is defined very broadly. And so it's probably applied most often in ways that people wouldn't think of as a RICO, right? Like a racketeering, another type game. And one thing I don't know offhand, I don't know if you know, does RICO apply overseas as well? Is that something that could apply to foreign corruption?
It can, because so think of these laws as kind of a casserole, right? You throw them all in the same bowl, and it becomes a bigger problem for whoever's trying to get out of it. The FCPA does provide for predicate offenses that can be prosecuted under RICO,
right?
And money laundering, of course, is a big one. The Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2020 expanded the way that we look at money laundering and counter threat financing. So obviously there's been a big focus by, the West and other countries as well on terrorist financing. And so how do we combat that? well, it's not just one tool, it's all of these tools, and they all complement each other in terms of, we find something bad, what else is it touching? What else is it poisoning, like the bad apple spoiling the barrel? Very rarely, if there's a RICO investigation, very rarely is it confined to simply just a couple things, illicit goods or weapons, contraband. There's all kinds of criminal activity, and so the Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2020 that allowed for RICO and the Fcpa to really extend their subpoena authorities and powers to go after international criminal activity.
Now, another law, which may be related, which I've heard of in the news in the last few years, I don't remember the name of it, but it's a law that essentially prohibits providing material support to organizations or entities that have been designated as, terrorist or, are on the sort of list. Is that something that plays into the type of work that you do, or the type of, corruption concerns that are out there?
Well, it's not anything that I have personally been involved with, but yes, I mean, you got to think that these things are all interconnected, right? If I am a person who is trying to purposefully finance terrorism or threat financing, to make a broader term, then how am I doing that? Again, we talked about the money needs to, you have to have a very clear origin, right? And it has to be legal. You have to have a very clear transit, and that has to be legal. And you have to have a very clear and legal end recipient. If any one of those is illicit or illegal, then the whole thing is bad. So I may be trying to do good and donate to what I think is a charity, but that charity in the middle, now I, as an individual, might not be liable for it, but that charity is obviously soliciting funds with a nefarious purpose in mind. And so that would be absolutely where money seemingly innocently donated is used for threat financing.
Right. Well, so let me ask you about your experience, consulting for companies doing overseas work. So have you been involved in internal investigations or helping companies set up compliance programs to help prevent or root out corrupt practices?
Yes. So I've been fortunate not to be a part of any investigations, nor have I been on the side trying to help somebody through an investigation, but I have helped various entities to develop that compliance program and really train their employees who are about to go overseas, who are going to be posted somewhere, or they're going for a project-based operation. Let's take the hotel in South Sudan, in Juba, South Sudan. I needed to help people understand the culture, the customs. That's not necessarily tied to the Fcpa, but if you don't understand what you're getting into and what kind of playground you're walking into, then you don't know the rules, right? And go back to the soccer game where you're hitting me with a hockey stick. If I don't know that's a possibility, then I'm ill prepared for the game. And so trying to help these people to understand not only what the rules and the laws are, but the customs and the traditions and how you have to navigate all of those together, coupled with the legitimate business needs of that company. And how do we meet those needs? How do we make this venture successful? It's difficult, but I've helped to develop those programs. And one of the things that people have to understand is that in some economies, in some emerging markets and other places, without those payments, business doesn't happen. Well, right. That's tough, right? And what do you do? It can be tempting, especially because I think there are some countries that don't play by the same rules, and that's not necessarily fair to Americans trying to do business.
Right. And actually, so one of the audience questions is, if you're a legal professional or, a law student, if you're interested in doing foreign corporate compliance, what sort of background should you try and develop? Is it just taking certain coursework in law school? Should someone have connections to a certain country or familiarize themselves with a certain culture? What's the best way to get into this sort of thing?
That's a huge question, right? Let me try to break that apart. So, and I'll use myself as an example. When I went to the University of Liverpool, I wanted to get an LLM in international business law because I thought it would be great to be working in Europe as a lawyer. Problem is, there are plenty of lawyers in Europe who know how to be lawyers in Europe. So that didn't work out. And that's how I got kind of by default pushed to places where people aren't comfortable, right? The rule of law is not well established. And how do we operate? And then I credit my military and police background because I was able to go into what I call expeditionary legal environments where the rule of law is not prevalent. The rules of the game aren't really clearly defined. The comforts of home aren't there. It's a little tough, and you have to use that the detective toolkit to really solve that problem. What are we trying to do? I want to build a warehouse. Great. What roads are you going to use? There's no roads. Okay, what land are you going to use? I don't know. Well, what family are you talking to? Great. So there's multiple things. So if somebody wanted to get into it, that's a great question because I fell into it. And I was referred by word of mouth for getting one project done, and that turned into just referral after referral. But I would say if somebody wanted to study these things, there's tons of e-learning programs that you don't even have to leave your home. You can read up on it and become book smart on it. And then while you're trying to research this stuff and learn this stuff, do a little more research. See who's working where. If you want to work with a government entity, if you want to work with a non-government organization, there's definitely people who can benefit from having somebody smart on how to keep them out of jail. So whether that's in Africa, and I love Africa, I keep talking about it, but Africa it's the wild frontier in a lot of ways, right? There's a lot of opportunity, good and bad. So I would say just you have to learn. You have to study. You have to know what you don't know, and you can only figure that stuff out by talking to people who've done it.
Thank you. Appreciate that. One big question I've had listening to you talk about this is, we've been talking about these American anti-corruption laws for overseas, right? We've got the Fcpa, RICO, anti-money laundering, wire fraud, mail fraud, all sorts of things. I guess the question I have is there a view that this is actually putting American businesses at a disadvantage, right? Because if I'm an American company and I'm trying to go into country X and develop a project versus I'm a company from China or Korea or Brazil or whatever the country is, right? If their company doesn't have to follow these same anti-corruption laws, well, will it just be the case that they pay the bribe, we don't, they get the contract and we don't? I mean, is there that dynamic going on, or do we think that the anti-corruption laws are actually helping?
Well, let me address the first part first. Yes, and using China as a perfect example, we can't necessarily buy a government official lunch because the Fcpa doesn't. When they say bribe, it's not necessarily cash; it's anything of value. So. Is the lunch of value? You get them a 59-cent taco from Taco Bell, it's probably okay. But China will give these people BMWs. And we're not on a level playing field anyway outside of this because the Chinese government will self-finance. One of the biggest problems in emerging markets is the governments don't necessarily have the cash. They have the resources, they're resource rich. And so a business coming in, needing to get paid to mobilize its people and get supplies and building materials, et cetera, they need cash to do that. China will pay that. And China will come in and they will say, we will build this for you in exchange for certain mineral rights or other extractives, oil or food. Food security is a big issue for China. So when we look at the Fcpa, we can't even compete with that because let's say China didn't finance. I can't give somebody a car. And if you're an official that I'm trying to work with, and I can't even take you to lunch, and China can give you a car, who do you think you're going to work with?
Right.
So, does the Fcpa work? I think that was the second part of your question. Yeah, absolutely. And why and how? Well, it keeps the people. Look, let's talk about different leagues, right? Because China's in a different league in that sense because of how and what they're willing to do. But let's go to the West, right? So I'm an American business and you're let's say a British business. We are both held to similar standards. Now the UK has their UK Bribery Act, and that's actually a little more severe than the Fcpa, right? Because the Fcpa covers bribes or anything of value paid to a foreign government official, while the UK Bribery Act covers payments to any person to induce them to act improperly. Well, that's pretty vague, right?
So even a foreign national working for a private company, you're saying?
Can be.
Wow.
Can be. So they also impose more severe penalties than the FCPA, and the UK Bribery Act covers being bribed, not just bribing others. So because we know that there are British expats living overseas and working in positions of authority, as I mentioned, Qatar, right? Mid-level functionaries are pretty much all foreigners, right?
And American law doesn't prohibit that? If I'm an American businessman and a foreign national tries to pay me a bribe, that's not prohibited?
It's not the way the FCPA is designed. The FCPA is to go after bad actors trying to impose undue influence on a foreign government official. So well, now, if let's say I was the American working overseas and you were an American company trying to bribe me, we could potentially both go down because we're both Americans and we're both still subject to American law.
Right, right.
But let's say that company was from China and I'm an American working overseas somewhere. First of all, how's the Department of Justice going to find out, right? Unless there's that whistleblower we were talking about,
right.
It's tough. And they can't be everywhere. They can't enforce everything. So, and they're not, and the FCPA isn't designed to cover everything. It's designed to level the playing field.
Well, so what about leveling the playing field? And actually, this is a question from an audience member as well. So, if there's a country where there appears to be no way of doing business without engaging in bribes or other practices that are driven by the FCPA, if that's just the norm there, is the American response, then you're not going to do business there? Or is there any sort of relaxation of these restrictions given the local customs? I mean, is that just the end of the story?
Well, they won't relax the provisions of the FCPA, but we have to remember that in most countries that we want to do business in, we have a consulate or an embassy, and we can appeal to them for help, right? We can appeal to they have regional security officers and economic officers and other people who their express purpose for being there is to assess the economy and also help to bring in foreign direct investment. So I guess if it's a mom and pop operation trying to go into an emerging economy, good luck, right? But if it's a reasonable sized company, they're going to have the mechanism to at least have a sit down with a higher government official to be able to talk through it and to explain the benefit and to work around the outside money, if you will, right? Or the express payments or whatever term we want to call the bribe. So yes, but a lot of times people come in, they have no way of getting around the bribe, the payments, they're done. They can't continue.
Wow. Have you ever had occasion to do that, to work with any representatives of a local embassy?
Yes. Yep. In Tanzania and South Sudan, well, actually, in every African country, one of the first things I've done is introduce myself to the embassy, just because Africa is dangerous. I mean, let's not kid each other, right? There's everything there wants to eat you. So, I mean, there's lions in Africa, right? So if I disappear, I want somebody to know about it. More than that, I want my project to succeed. I want my client to succeed. And so while I was being a bit tongue-in-cheek a second ago, I will engage the embassy from the beginning so that they understand what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how we're trying to do it. And if sometimes they will tell me, that's not going to work here. Okay, why not? And then we have that dialogue. Then I'm a little better prepared to go out and advise my client. Or if I'm not acting as an attorney per se, if I'm that legal program manager where I'm trying to help get a contract through, or if I'm a legal business advisor, right? So or consultant where I'm helping just to steer them clear of violations of the FCPA or the UK Bribery Act, because I do have clients that are from the UK. Then the more informed I am and the more tied in that our operation is with the embassy, whether it's US or UK or whoever, the client entity, whatever nationality they are, the better for everybody. Even though, I mean, look, we're not trying to go into Somalia, right? That's pretty dangerous overall. So, the waters and the rough patches, and to work around those bribes, right? So that doesn't become a sticking point where you bang your head against the wall and you quit and you go home and you wasted money, time, and effort.
Right. And this is sort of paraphrasing an audience question as well. I mean, does any of the work that you do or that others in your position do involve trying to educate the foreign governments themselves about the norms of the Fcpa, the norms of American anti-corruption, try and help them understand why you're held to these standards, and hopefully they will hold other countries to those standards as well?
Absolutely. When I was in Qatar, as I mentioned, with the public-private partnership, we needed to demonstrate, number one, that we're capable of doing the work. Number two, how we would do the work, because it's difficult sometimes. There's absolute differences in cultural norms. For instance, some of the government officials we were talking to could not understand why it was important to provide migrant workers with safe, humane living conditions, right? And I was told by one of them, well, a lot of these people come from countries where there's no electricity, so what's the big deal? Well, the first part of that's true. The second part, what's the big deal? It is a big deal, right? We're trying to do something different. So we have to educate them on why we're trying to do what we're doing. And that doesn't necessarily tie into the Fcpa per se,
Right.
but we need to help them to understand our constraints of doing business overseas. What can we do? What won't we do? How do we work together to get the mission accomplished? And if you look back about 10 years, Qatar was being absolutely beaten up by The Guardian and some other British publications over their human rights violations and questions of that. So they were, I wouldn't say desperate, that's pretty dramatic, but they were anxious to find a resolution. And so, for them, it's, well, we'll just do whatever. Okay, great. You can go ahead and do that because you're the government of Qatar. We can't do that because that's how we go to jail. So let's sit down, let's figure it out. Let's get everybody on the same page. You understand that we can't operate that way. And so what's the workaround? What's the solution?
Got it. So are there any particular features of the Fcpa or these other laws that you think aren't working well? They're either too stringent, too lenient, they are kind of missing the mark about what they're trying to accomplish?
Well, I already touched on it with, sometimes we are unnecessarily handcuffed in doing business. And I say unnecessarily. I mean, there's a difference between me buying you lunch and me putting an envelope of cash in your pocket. But where do you draw the line? Well, they drew the line. It's about $40. You can buy lunch less than $40. So is it too stringent in that sense? Yeah, I mean, it can be, right? Especially if $40 doesn't really cover anything, which, inflation, right? Are they too lenient? No, absolutely not. I mean, not they're very, very stringent. So, how could they be different? Well, we've seen improvements, right? I mean, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act was passed in '77. Congress amended it in 1988. Will there be further amendments? Sure, but there will also be other laws that are passed to accommodate the changing global environment, the global market. And that's one of the things, I mean, especially digital currencies. How do we track that? How do we make sure that those payments are above board? So I think there will be differences. I think there will be changes. I think there will be improvements, but I couldn't speak to what those might actually look like.
Right. But in the time you've been doing this, you've seen, well, I guess I don't want to ask this leading question, have you seen general trends or shifts towards more of a recognition of the rule of law, less corruption, or is it really just, very idiosyncratic country by country?
Well, it is country by country. On the one hand, there have been changes. I've been doing this now for over a decade, and of course there have been changes. We're a more global economy, a more global society. People understand that, and I say people, governments understand that Americans won't do business that way. It doesn't stop them from trying. And as I mentioned, Pfizer and Eli Lilly, Deutsche Bank. I mean, Deutsche Bank got hammered. They paid a criminal penalty of $80 million.
Wow.
In addition to another $43 million in disgorgement of and prejudgment interest. So all that said, I mean, of course, Deutsche Bank is huge. We could talk about that another time, but governments understand. They understand that I'm not Deutsche Bank, right? I don't have the pockets to pay that as they probably have that in their couch, right? That's just change to them, not to me. So for the average small, medium-sized business going into some of these countries, it is understood that they're not going to be able to put their hand out and get something under the table, because small and medium-sized businesses aren't sophisticated enough to take advantage of those gray areas or outright illegally participate in business there.
Right. Now we only have a few minutes left, so I want to start to wrap up by asking, in your experience, right, what do you think are some best practices for legal professionals, business people, right, to avoid corruption issues or, minimize their liability? What are some rule of thumb practices that you find work well, regardless of what country you're in, that, people who are looking to go into these areas of this line of work, things they should be aware of, things, pitfalls they should avoid? What are some, I guess, tips you would give for people, what to do, what not to do?
Well, this is pretty basic, but you have to know the law and you have to know your client, right? So you have to understand the importance of Fcpa compliance. You have to understand the importance of local laws, and you have to understand your client. Is your client the kind of person that won't listen to you and will act anyway? Well, that's not good, right? So there's so many different, like I said, e-learning courses that a person could avail themselves of to get smarter on these things, to get smarter. I mean, it can be a bit mind-numbing if you get into the actual United States code and you're reading that. But good luck if that's how some people learn. Great, but you have to know the law. You have to know the country. You have to do a little homework. You have to understand, number one, what am I walking into? Number two, what am I trying to sell here? If it's some kind of widget that's great in one country, doesn't mean it's going to be great in this other one. So be smart, be a good advocate for your client, but also be able to, and don't be afraid to tell them if their baby's ugly. People don't want to hear it, but they need to hear it sometimes. We need to be frank with our clients. We need to tell them, you will go to jail if you continue this pattern of behavior. And they need to hear it, because sometimes it is frustrating. So, and I've seen it. They're spending money, they're wasting time. They want to get the project is behind, it's over budget, but if I just paid this little, it's like $10,000, not that much money. True, but it's what comes after that makes the 10,000, that's a drop in the bucket.
Right. And I think that's a really good point for lawyers generally, right? Is that we're not yes men, right? Our clients are hiring us to give our advice and our counsel. And sometimes that's not telling our client what they want to hear, right? It's
absolutely
the unvarnished truth about how they might be in the wrong, and they need to know that. Absolutely.
And I think the best thing I can do for my client is tell them exactly where they will go off the path, right? This is, if you do this, expect this result. That's the best thing I can do. And I can only advise them of that if I know what I'm talking about, right? I know the law, I know my client, and Well, Conan, thank you so much. Again, this has been very fascinating for me. I've never had a chance to speak with someone who's just been to so many places and dealt with so many governments. So it's been fascinating for me. I hope the audience has enjoyed as well. I want to thank you all who tuned in for your time. Thank you, everybody. Thank you again, Conan, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next installment of our Distinguished Speaker webinar series. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Take care.